Intergenerational discourse. Give any two generations and there is some kind of hyper-specific issue that the two have about one another. And constantly in the news and the general media, we see different expressions of this discourse come up. But where does it come from? Clearly, it's a pattern of behavior that keeps on repeating itself. So what is the cause for it? And is it potentially getting worse? And further from that, what are the implications of this kind of discourse? Some of the divide seems somewhat natural. Children will try to rebel from their parents. The parents will look down on all their wrongdoings and question what the hell they did with their kids, and discourse arises from this. And the literature does somewhat support this view of things. Older generations are likely to focus on areas that they excelled in. So if they excelled in self-restraint, then they're going to point out all of the ways in which the younger generation is giving in to their desires. For just one example, but you kind of get the idea. Much of this has to do with flawed memory. It isn't an actual accurate depiction that the generations before were actually these saints or this much better at any given thing, at working, at saving, at all these things. It's a flawed memory that, oh, look at all these good things that we did, all these good things that I remember, and we didn't have to deal with this, that, and the other. We didn't have these specific flaws, when in reality, they had their own flaws that they were dealing with, their own shortcomings as a generation. And then beyond that, the younger generation, one, is going to retaliate because factually it is incorrect, and secondly, from frustrations culturally, that the older generation is behind on the times, isn't keeping up with different things, both consequential and inconsequential things. There is always a cultural gap between generations. There's changes in technology. There's different key historical events that help develop the mindset of the generation, and just general cultural shifts that come with time. These grow larger and larger as you get a larger age gap. So the gap culturally between baby boomers and Gen Alpha is much larger than that of baby boomers and Gen X. This can explain some of the smaller, more culturally based things. Fashion being a huge issue between Gen Z and millennials just has to do with time and culture shifting. Similarly, changes in technology are how we get people talking about how TV was going to ruin millennials and the internet was going to ruin Gen Z, and now the iPads are ruining Gen Alpha. No matter what, with new technology, there's going to be contentions and disagreements on what role this technology should play in the next generation. Beyond this, we get the clashing of ideals and values. I have very inherent beliefs about gender and sexuality because when I first started learning and questioning these things, I was given a lot of information about queer people. And so those are very inherent, and my first reaction to things is through that lens. Whereas those older than me are only learning them far after they've already established their framework to see those things through. So their instinctual thought is very different from mine. And it's up to them whether or not their actions and reactions to this coincide with their first thought or with the more updated views of things. A big factor for whether or not someone might learn these updated views on things is how much they're interfacing with those younger generations. Somewhat anecdotally, but my mother's a school teacher and my dad is a manager. So she's constantly learning slang and lingo from the kids, and he has to keep up with some of the cultural shifts in social media. But beyond that, they both have also then had gay coworkers, trans students, and have then learned the language and culturally how to interact with those things appropriately given the modern day view on things. But what about when you don't have that kind of interfacing? And if you're not willing to reach out and look for the information yourself, then you're going to stay behind the times. There's evidence to show that this kind of interfacing is being reduced severely. And what could this spell for future division, and how severe is this generational division? First, let's take a little step back into history. While having very specific age groups, such as toddler, school age, preteens, teens, young adult, middle age, so on and so forth, is very intuitive to us now, this hasn't always been the case. It was with the rise of the industrialization that age groups became more defined and more prominent. Many of this was born for very good reasons. Laws to protect children necessitated legal definitions and specific ages to be defined to protect for child labor, against child marriages, and raising the age of consent. Further, with the standardization of public schooling, we get laws like truancy to ensure that children are in school. We even see the rise of juvenile courts to better accommodate and acknowledge differences between children and adults and how they should be treated and dealt with. These are all extremely positive things. In some ways, children should be protected and somewhat segregated from certain spaces in order to further this protection of them. We do need schools to be a very specific place for very specific age groups so that they can develop with other students. But throughout the 19th century and onward, we get more of a focus on just further niching down these age groups and somewhat separating the treatment of age groups, even beyond just developmental reasons. Teenagers were born in the 1950s because of the rise of this new specific age group that had free time and pocket money to spend. So there was new advertising, new products to cater for this specific age group. There were also new spaces just for them to hang out, which meant that they were no longer hanging out with people younger and older than them. These are just a few examples, but all of this kind of built up to divide these different age groups so that there's less interspersing of different age groups. I also think this is now being made worse as we enter the newest version of our housing and economic crisis. It's extremely hard for millennials and now Gen Z to reach certain adult benchmarks, which can then make it harder to interact with those that are Gen X, baby boomers who are more established and also in these like adult phases and adult spaces, because there's so many fundamental levels in which you cannot connect with them. So again, there's this huge divide between the adults who can do certain things and the adults who are failing on these certain things. And I don't think this is going to help or is helping with this kind of division and interacting or even hearing out other opinions. It can also make it harder to see yourself in these people that should be having more similar life experiences to you. In theory, someone who's 25 and someone who's 40 could both be homeowners with kids and working a 9-to-5 and relate over all these things. But if at 25 you still can't own a home and you're still living with your parents, you fundamentally cannot talk to this person the same way that you could otherwise. I also think the lack of third spaces is furthering this kind of divide. While in generations past, there were many community events and community spaces for people of all ages to come together, that isn't something that we're seeing anymore. Something notable specifically to do with intergenerational communication is church. Before, church was one event where everyone, no matter of age, would come together and be in the same space. With that, you also got other community events. You're gonna have church potlucks and church... I didn't go to church. I don't know. I know there's church like childcare and like probably like garage sales and I don't know. You have a bunch of events that then come from this. You then have women's groups who are specifically from your church and you just have more community opportunities. But with the decline of church attendance, as I am clearly an example of, and also the loss of third spaces, it's increasingly difficult for these kinds of things to be facilitated. I personally don't know any opportunities where I could go to a free event specifically to talk with other members of my community. And I think this pairs with the loneliness epidemic. If you're not talking with anyone, you certainly aren't talking with people of other generations and other ages. All this to say, I think that a lot of different problems are playing into this and it's playing into other problems, so on and so forth, but intergenerational communication is being lessened due to the lack of community in general. We also see this spreading into our idea of home and family units. As we began seeing the shift from working for a product to working for a wage, we saw the need for large families start to go down. You no longer need a huge family with uncles and aunts to help you run a ranch or a farm. You now can have 1 or 2 adults working to provide for a small family. This was made even smaller with the rise of the nuclear family. Now we not only have the idea of just 2 parents, 2 kids, and a dog, but also of a detached family unit. There's no grandparents or other family living in this home, or even necessarily interacting with you the same way that we would have seen in years past. No longer are we having intergenerational homes and communities to help support everyone, but detached individual units. However, now as we're seeing the rise of intergenerational homes necessitated by the cost of living crisis, we're also seeing more of the cost of losing these kind of family units. That there's a lack of support, a lack of mentorship, increased cost of living, and less help with the needs of children or elderly were all lost when we went to this nuclear family setup. Although there is plenty to be said about not having to live with your in-laws, there's also a reason why these things are helpful. Not least of all being the communication and the shared life experiences that are then shared between all members in the family. So both in the workplace, in our communities, and at home, we're seeing a huge downturn in how much different generations are actually able to communicate with one another and create solidarity. And that's kind of the bigger reason why I wanted to make this video. Something that strikes me is the loss of solidarity between generations. As I mentioned before, one of the huge issues that will rise conflict between generations is the idea of progressivism and conservatism. I don't know if I said those in the right tense, but we're going to pretend that I did at the very least. Those that are older feel that we're losing some of those core values, and so then have an issue with how the younger generation is approaching things. The younger generation feels that the older generation is being bigoted or behind and not accepting that change is necessary for a reason. We look back at those older generations and we focus on how they're hurting our current fights for progress, but in doing that, ignore the fights that they did fight and have won for us. To paint back to baby boomers, as they're the most obvious one that we paint this brush with, to call them all sexist is to ignore that the 60s and 70s brought women protections for education and work. To ignore their work is to ignore successful movements that we can learn from. To ignore people with wisdom, experience, and also a whole realm of voters. To paint them with this brush, when many of them did help with those fights, is only going to further remove them from these issues and wanting to vote or help with them. I'm using feminism as the example here because it's something I have more past experience in, but this applies to many things. Labor unions, queer rights, race, environmental issues, and more. But the theories that we reference for all of these things now find their roots in past movements that fought them first. The talking points, the ways to rally voters, it comes from a history. And to try and reinvent the wheel when people have already done it is a waste of time and resources. More than that, it makes me think of something that people say a lot about identity politics, that to separate ourselves by choice makes it easier for those in power to keep it from us. When we work together and consolidate our resources, it's much harder to contend with us and to keep us from making those strides. One of the key ways that those in power work to keep it is by segregating those who would work to try and take it from them. And we're just doing that work for them. So much of the political topics that come up with intergenerational discourse come from the same standard issues. Whether you're worried about how much your work is being compensated because you're now not going to have retirement, or because you're not currently getting a big enough wage, both of those can be fixed by addressing some of the key economic issues, the hoarding of money done by the 1%. But instead we focus on these hyper-specific versions of the issue rather than all coming together to try and tackle that bigger issue that tackles all of them. I said that so badly. You get the idea. We don't need to nitpick. We need to consolidate and tackle larger issues. I also think on a more philosophical lens, there's a lot that's lost when we aren't learning from those that are older than us and that came from before us. We're amidst a loneliness epidemic. And I know that even for me as someone who's younger and does have a social network to a degree, I still feel that crippling feeling and dread from loneliness. And it's made only worse for the elderly. The percentage of those over 60 talking to anyone under 36 about important matters is just 25%. The percentage of those over 60 talking with someone who isn't family about important issues is just 6%. This has a negative effect on their mental health. It's shown that mentorship and those relationships with those younger than them can boost elderly mental health, while the opposite has an inverse effect. People are living longer but spending that time alone, which is just kind of a bleak thought. And as someone who ages, and as people I love who are aging, as I'm sure you guys at least know someone who ages, it's a very bleak thought that we aren't really working to fix the issue of intergenerational communication, as I'm sure most of us don't really think about it either. It's going to affect us one day when we are that older generation. I also think there's many stories and skills that are lost with this. This gets into, again, a larger topic and philosophical issue on the loss of history and the loss of your family's personal history, or at least your loved one's personal history, and also of how much we value handiwork, craftsmanship, or even just crafts in the more traditional term, which are something that I think we largely associate with the older generation, and that was more valued in previous generations. It wasn't that long ago that people were hand making their clothes, their furniture, or at the very least able to mend those things ourselves, something that has continuously been going down in popularity and has been lost over time. And I think it's not helped, again, when we aren't communicating and having those things passed down to us. Before, it was a given that yes, your parents, your grandparents would teach you these skills, but more and more that's just not happening, and we're not really reaching out to learn these things from those we love or otherwise. Which again is just kind of another topic entirely, and more of a philosophical argument beyond just the discourse and political implications of these kind of issues, but I think it's still important and something that I'm personally very interested in. So, what is our final takeaway? Well, the large cause of intergenerational discourse is time. Time drives change, and we have to actively work to keep up with that change. And that the lack of communication and the growing divides between different age groups is only making that depersonalization, those generalizations worse, which then worsens the discourse, worsens the divides. And the real solution to that is just making an effort, I suppose. Many of the things that I was reading when I started reading about this are go volunteer at an elderly care home, or go join a book club, or different things like that, which is very much so personal decisions you can make. But as someone who does create content around political issues and these different things, I do wonder if I need to change my approach as an author. Something that I do, and that I think isn't uncommon when we're writing about progressive issues, is, okay, what is the current stance and what is the current issue? And something I wanted to do specifically with feminism is looking at past political movements and kind of dissecting how they worked and what made them successful. And rather than discounting old literature on these topics, is involving it into my thinking and my approach, and even possibly the messaging of it. Usually when we're fighting for feminist ideals, we're going to be reaching out to the youngest people possible, because those are the people who are going to interact with it and click back on it. But is there something to be said that, okay, but these people agree, echo chambers, what is to be done to try and interact with those older people and their opinions and figuring out why that is? I don't know. Possibly. I guess that's something that will have to be seen as a journey of what the approach is and what doesn't work. And I think also remembering that while right now I am in the group that is like intuitively in the know of what's coming up, because just like the content that I am consuming is building this new culture, is keeping in mind that that will not always be the case, and how can I pointedly make sure that I am still aware of everything that's coming in. Something that I know that I personally have been seeing around and personally believe in is like getting rid of some of those ideas of like cringe culture and things like that, of how can I continue to interact with the younger generation and not see these changes and these interests as inherently negative, but look at why it's happening and what effect is it having both positive and negative. Like content farms and some of like Elsa Gate-esque things, that's obviously negative. Are kids on iPads inherently negative? No, there's a lot to be learned from them. There's a lot to be said that there's going to be those negative like coping mechanisms and ways of getting your kid to be quiet, but those have always existed. So what makes this one that much different? What things are they interested in? What issues are going to arise from that? Just different things like that. And now I think I'm getting fully into the rambly territory of the wrap-up, so we're going to put a little pin in this and say that those were all topics that we can explore later. But I hope you get the general gist. Have a wonderful day, night, evening, wherever you are, and I'll see you soon.